Everybody, thanks so much for joining us today for another webinar on Dutch immigration. I'm a member of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Netherland-America Foundation. And among other things, our chapter holds an annual fundraising dinner each spring called the Ambassadors Awards Dinner in honor of previous American ambassadors to the Netherlands. And we host occasional lectures, such as this one, on civic, cultural, and historical topics. If you'd like to learn more about the NAF or the Washington, D.C. chapter, or you have some ideas about future presentations, please go to our website, thenaf.org. This is the third in a series of webinars our chapter has hosted on Dutch immigration. As you can imagine, many of our chapter members are descendants of Dutch immigrants. In my case, for example, all four of my grandparents were born in the Netherlands, and I will forever be curious about what motivated them to come to the United States and how common was their story and their experiences among the thousands of Dutch that came to North America both before and after them. To learn more about Dutch immigration and its impact on the United States, we're honored once again to have as our guest Dr. Robert Schoone-Jungen. He's Professor Emeritus at Calvin University, where he taught history for many years. His work has concentrated on immigration to the United States through 1920, the American presidency, and the impact of religion on everyday lives. In today's webinar, we'll take about 45 minutes to hear from Dr. Schoone-Jungen, and we'll leave about 15 minutes to answer your questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of the screen to direct your questions. We'll do our best to answer as many of your questions as possible. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Schoone-Jungen. Thank you so much.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And I assume some of you are having lunch, and if you are, I hope your potato chips are Old Dutch from the bakery in Minneapolis. I brought a couple of security blankets with me. This one I'll show you right away. We're going to talk about the Dutch image and how the Dutch image kind of develops over time a little bit today, and how are Dutch people influential and how are they remembered in the United States. The topic is basically immigration, and I have about 45 minutes to do 375 years worth of history. So what I did to try to give this some kind of a structure is to come up with three main periods of Dutch immigration. Just try to remember that just because I have these cutoff dates doesn't mean that nobody came in between, because obviously that's not true. But these are the main waves of Dutch immigration that came to North America, and we're going to look at each one of them for about 15 minutes or so, and look at some of the main characteristics of each of these three waves. And then also look at the legacy each of these waves have imposed or left behind on the American story. So we begin with New Netherland and the beginning of colonization by the Dutch West India Company, beginning in roughly 1624, with the establishment of New Amsterdam on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. And a couple of things to remember about what's happening here is the Dutch West India Company is a trading company. The colony is its possession. This is not free enterprise economics here. This is a mercantile company that is looking to make profits for its shareholders in Amsterdam. And the West India Company's interests go far beyond just what becomes the United States and far beyond just the New Netherland colony. The New Netherland colony is part of the picture for them, a significant one, but not the only one. One of the problems that the New Netherland colony had from the beginning until the British took it over in 1664 was getting enough people to come to New Netherland to provide the labor that was needed for the fur trading that they hoped to do, to sustain the colony by providing food for people who lived there, to have the people who could service the ships, repair the ships as they came into the port, these kinds of things. So one of the ideas that the West India Company uses to try to lure people to North America is what's called the patroon system, where a person with stature, a person with connections to the company, could get a substantial grant of land along the Hudson River, and then with the understanding that they would go out and recruit people to actually live on these estates. Quite frankly, this system becomes kind of a disappointment in terms of the number of people who were actually attracted to become tenants of these big landholders. Another group that obviously is going to come with the West India Company are going to be the administrators. The most famous of them being Peter Stuyvesant, who served as the Director General of the New Netherland colony for about 15 years, and actually stayed in New York after the English take over the colony. Another factor, beginning especially after 1626, within 2 years, will be the presence of the Dutch Reformed Church, which is not a state church in the sense of the Church of England, but it is a privileged religious organization. It is the first congregation organized. The first congregation organized in New Netherland is a Dutch Reformed Church in New York, what becomes New York City, beginning in 1626. And the company makes sure that a minister will come to take care for this congregation. Another issue, of course, is that in the Netherlands, there's not a whole lot of reason for a lot of people to want to leave in the 1600s. This is a period of prosperity. This is for the most part, a period of political stability. New Netherland tends to be a place where people will come in the 1600s looking for some peace in the wake of the upheavals of the 30 Years' War that's going on to the east of New Netherland. And this chronic problem of labor in the New Netherland colony will lead to a diversified population, where there will be folks such as French Huguenots who will come to New Netherland, as well as people from Portugal. The West India Company is involved in the African slave trade, so there will be an African population that will come, not by its own choice, obviously. New Netherland will also house people of Jewish background who come looking for religious tolerance. And in fact, they will enjoy these things for a number of years. The numbers of people who come to New Netherland from the Netherlands will remain relatively small, but their smallness is one of the things that will make them so cohesive for so long. They stick together. To give you a couple of examples of some of these folks who came over to New Netherland, there's a fellow by the name of Cornelius Mason van Boermalsen, who comes from Gelderland. He arrives when he's about 30 years old. He settles in the Albany area, and engages in a number of businesses, farming, just whatever he could do to kind of make a living. His family will stay, and his great-grandson, a fellow by the name of Abraham, will farm a few miles south of Albany in a little place in a village called Kinderhook. The very name is indicative of the Dutch presence. By the time Abraham is alive, we're well into the 1700s. And we have along the Hudson River these indicators that the Dutch are still there and that this had been a Dutch colony. And the place names like Kinderhook is one of them. Abraham, who by this time is known as Van Buren, is a member of the Dutch Reformed Church in Kinderhook. He operates a tavern and an inn in Kinderhook, which is one of the stop-off points on the post road that existed on the east side of the Hudson River between New York and Albany. So that Abraham Van Buren's tavern is the kind of a place where people of means, people of importance in what was now the New York colony will stay. In the 1770s and the 1780s, in Abraham Van Buren's home, the first language is still Dutch. This is 100 years after the New Netherland colony had disappeared into the British Empire. Abraham will side with the Patriot cause during the American Revolution. And in 1782, he will have a son, Martin. And there he is, the 8th president of the United States. Martin Van Buren grows up in Kinderhook in the 1780s, speaking Dutch until he went to school. And as I've mentioned in others of these lectures, Martin Van Buren holds the distinction of being the only president of the United States for whom English was his second language. I think this is indicative of how hard the descendants of the New Netherland Dutch settlers worked at maintaining their identity in the face of living under British rule. In fact, the Dutch language will hold on in the more rural areas of upstate New York and northern New Jersey until well into the 1820s, 1830s. There will still be Dutch language church services being conducted in Reformed churches in upstate New York and in New Jersey as late as the 1830s. It will not be until about 1831 that the Reformed Church will finally come out with its own English language hymnal. Here's another example of another one. This is someone who arrived in 1649, roughly, and his name is Klaas Martens van Rosenveld. Comes from the province of Zeeland, where he was born in roughly 1623. He does not live long, only 10 years in New Netherland. One of the reasons he comes is because in 1647, when Peter Stuyvesant became the Director General of the colony, Stuyvesant tried to lure and entice more settlers to come to the colony by providing incentives for newcomers to, you could own land, you could get your own land, things of that sort. And Van Rosenveld apparently is enticed by this. And within a few years of arrival, he buys 50 acres of land in the middle of Manhattan Island. Today, this is roughly the spot where the Empire State Building is. What's important about him? Well, there's a number of things. One of them is he has a son who survives him and lives long enough to have sons of his own and daughters of his own who live long enough to be married. And Nicholas Roosevelt, the second Roosevelt, will have two sons who live to be adults, get married, and have families of their own. The result of those two sons is going to be two branches of the Roosevelt family, one harbored on Long Island and the other one in the Hudson Valley. And you think about the odds of this, remarkably enough, this family will produce two presidents of the United States within 30 years of each other. Distant cousins, but relatives nonetheless, both descendants of this one New Netherlander. And as you can begin to sense, while the New Netherlanders may have been few in number, they will far exceed their numbers when it comes to the influence that they are going to have on New York and New Jersey, and for that matter, the United States. A third one, Theodorus Frelinghuysen. Theodorus Frelinghuysen was actually born in Ostfriesland in 1691. He is ordained as a minister in the Hervormde Kerk in the Netherlands. And in 1720, so 60 years, 55, 60 years after the fall of the New Netherland colony, Frelinghuysen accepts a call to come to central New Jersey, to the Raritan Valley, to pastor Dutch Reformed churches there. So here we are 60 years after the fall of New Netherland, and when churches in the middle colonies, Dutch churches in the middle colonies were looking for ministers, they were still bringing them in from the Netherlands. Frelinghuysen will be active in the Raritan Valley for about 30, 40 years. The church you have here, one of the churches that he serves is Reddington, New Jersey, and this is a later version of the church that this congregation will have. He actually pastored about 4 different congregations, some of them almost as a itinerant pastor. But his real mark on the Reformed Church and on American Protestantism, for that matter, is that he became one of the proponents of what we now know as the Great Awakening of the 1740s. And one of the outgrowths of the Great Awakening of the 1740s is a push by people like Frelinghuysen in the direction of establishing schools in the colonies to provide clergy for the expanding number of congregations that even the Dutch Reformed Church has to pastor as their numbers grow, in part at least because of the Great Awakening, but also because of just internal growth. If you look at these families, they have large numbers of kids, and and the mortality rate for children declines, so there are just more and more of these descendants. Frelinghuysen himself will not live to see the fruit of his educational labors, but he has 2 sons who became Reformed ministers, and they became instrumental in organizing a seminary for the Dutch Reformed Church that they placed in the town of New Brunswick. And that, of course, becomes the progenitor of what today is known as Rutgers University. What's most remarkable about Frelinghuysen is his grandchildren, specifically one grandson. He had a grandson named Frederick. And Frederick Frelinghuysen becomes very heavily involved in the American Revolution on the Patriots side, becomes a general in the army, rises to political prominence in what becomes the state of New Jersey. And in 1793, Frederick Frelinghuysen is elected to the United States Senate. What's remarkable about him is that he will be the first of 7 generations of Frelinghuysen's who will represent the state of New Jersey in either the Congress or in the office of the federal, some office or other in the federal government. His son, one of his, Theodore Frelinghuysen, the second one here, let me highlight him, this fellow right here, will be a candidate for vice president of the United States in 1844 on the Whig ticket with Henry Clay. This Frelinghuysen will serve as Secretary of State for President Chester Arthur. This Frelinghuysen will serve in the United States Senate for a term. He's actually holds the distinction of being the first United States Senator popularly elected, one of the first ones popularly elected. And then there will be Peter Frelinghuysen, who will be a member of the House for a number of terms, and then Rodney, who retired just a couple of years ago. So we have literally from the beginning of the American Republic down to the present day, there have been Frelinghuysen's sitting in the United States Congress or being officials of the federal government. Now, to pull this together and talk about the legacy can be seen in this map here. And you'll notice this kind of pinkish area here. This is the area that becomes heavily populated by people of the New Netherland colony, of the descendants of the New Netherland settlers. All about out into Long Island, out to roughly to the east edge of the borough of Queens, all the way up almost to Lake George, down, beginning to go down up the Mohawk Valley, and then these valleys of northern New Jersey, between the ridges of the Appalachians, these become the place where you will find, for instance, the old Dutch Reformed churches. These are areas that are settled by the descendants of the New Netherlanders. You will find families with names like Van Winkle and Van Houten and Brinkerhoff and Wortendijk, who are the descendants of the New Netherlanders. These are the areas where the Dutch language will hang on until well into the 19th century, which is critically important for what happens to prompt the second wave of Dutch immigration. So that the legacy of the New Netherlanders is going to become their status, for instance, in what becomes New York's old social elite, with names like Rensselaer, Van Cortlandt, Schuyler. Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law is one of these descendants of the New Netherlanders, Philip Schuyler. The role of the Dutch Reformed Church in keeping the language particularly in the rural areas. The role of this old New York elite in the founding of the New York Historical Society in 1804. Their first big bash is to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Henry Hudson's voyage into the Hudson Valley. And the role of the New York Historical Society in placing the story of the Dutch Republic into an American context, with the idea that the Dutch Republic becomes one of the prototypes for what becomes American federalism. And one of the promoters of this idea, and eventually in the 1850s, one of the presidents of the New York Historical Society is the minister, Reverend Thomas DeWitt, who is I guess you would call him the chief pastor of the Collegiate Church in New York. And DeWitt can speak Dutch. He grew up in the Central Hudson Valley. His name is indicative of the family that he is in. One of his cousins is DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, who's responsible for the building of the Erie Canal. And DeWitt, in the 1840s, as a prominent clergyman of one of the most prominent churches in the city of New York, is not happy with where he sees the United States heading socially in the 1840s. He sees too much turbulence. He sees, the Sabbath isn't what it used to be. These are the kinds of things that worry him. And Thomas DeWitt in the 1840s, among other things, decides that what America really needs is more Dutch immigrants with the right kinds of characteristics to make the United States a more wholesome place for people to live. So that when DeWitt hears about the problems that are happening in the Netherlands in the 1830s and the 1840s with religious persecution, with economic problems, with political problems, De Witt begins to make inquiries in the Netherlands, and he will personally go to the Netherlands in about 1845-46 to see what he can do to help these religious people who have good reason to want to leave the Netherlands in the mid-1840s and recruit them to come to the United States, which brings about the second act. And that is the Dutch immigration that comes between 1846 and 1914. There are a lot of problems in the Netherlands. The economic problems being a major piece. Also, along with that, in the 1840s, the Netherlands will suffer from the potato famine, the same blight that was that caused so many heartaches in Ireland. It comes to the Netherlands a year or two later. The fact that there are religious dissenters in the Netherlands who are unhappy with the new order of things that came to be in the wake of the fall of Napoleon, where the Dutch Republic is turned into a monarchy, where the preferred church is turned into a state church, where that church, who the clergy was in that church, was no longer really in the hands of the laymen to decide who the ministers would be. They became more state functionaries. And so there are a number of people who secede from the state church beginning in 1834. And they are subject to persecution, official persecution by the government. So you put these things together because they're working off of each other. People in economic distress who are looking for comfort will look often for religious. Will look to religion to help them understand what's going on around them. They will see the powers that be as hostile to them, and the powers that be will do things that are hostile to these religious dissenters, because religious uniformity is considered to be one of the bedrocks of the political beliefs of political systems of that day. But political uniformity or religious uniformity is something that's trying to be established in the Netherlands in a way that it had not been before. And these people will become, many of these people will become good candidates to become immigrants. What's going to pull them will be the obvious things. One will be cheap land on the frontier. As the infant mortality rate begins to decline in many areas of the Netherlands, we have more sons who are growing to adulthood, and the idea of subdividing the land over and over again to provide land for the sons to farm on just is not going to happen. And so the idea of going out to what would be the frontier of the 1840s, which means we're talking Michigan, Wisconsin, Northern Illinois, Northern Indiana, the extreme eastern part of Iowa. These will be places where you could go and get cheap land, relatively inexpensive land. Now remember, this is the 1840s, so we're not talking about homesteading yet. We're talking about land situations where you're going to have to buy the land. Employment opportunities, the expansion of American industry taking place in the 1830s and in the 1840s in places like Rochester, New York, Buffalo, New York, Paterson, New Jersey. The hope that you could get a job and get a factory job. Notice, we're looking at employment opportunities that do not require a lot of education. What they require is a strong back and the will to put up with bad conditions, and the belief that if you hang on long enough, you can improve your lot in life. Another factor for the religious dissenters in the Netherlands is going to be the separation of church and state in the United States, where they don't have to worry about the government telling them how their churches are going to operate or who the ministers are going to be. And then the encouragement of Dutch Reformed ministers like De Witt. So that when Dutch immigrants begin to appear in New York Harbor in organized groups in late 1846, there will be people at the dock waiting for them who can speak Dutch, De Witt being one of them. And over a period of time, he's a very busy man. They organize a committee that is headed by a man named Brinkerhoff, who's from another one of these old New Netherland families. And he will organize making sure that there are people at the docks to help the immigrants as they come off of the ships. If they get stuck in New York, as many of them did, people like De Witt and Brinkerhoff will find places for them to either stay for temporarily or to settle permanently in the New York metropolitan area. And they're being told by people like De Witt that they have national traits that will help make America a better country. That provides a dilemma for them. These three things, or these four things, they are going to be there in one form or another for most of this roughly 70-year period where we have the peak of Dutch immigration. Some combination of these things are always going to be there. They will rise and fall, as this chart indicates. This goes between, this is 1880 to 1920. If this did 20 years earlier, you would see the same thing, that there will be a spike in Dutch immigration that will peak about 1855, 56, and then drop. It will stay down until about 1866. Then it will rise again. It will drop in 1872 and stay there until you get to this one here. And you'll notice that there's these ups and downs. These ups and downs coincide with both problems, economic, social, political problems in the Netherlands, and also then economic problems, especially, and social problems in the United States. Dutch immigration basically stops during the American Civil War. Dutch immigration will tail way off during hardships like the Panic of 1873. You'll notice there's a drop off in the 1890s, again, because of the economic panic of 1893 in the United States. Here's an indicator as to commonly, who are the Dutch immigrants who are coming over. And you'll notice from this sampling, it is overwhelmingly unskilled labor. There are skills, tailors, carpenters, people of that sort. Notice clergymen are part of this. But white collar folks, by and large, are not forming the Dutch immigration of this 70-year period. Where they're coming from is very concentrated in the Netherlands, by both province and also then within the province by municipality. One thing I can't show you is how this will shift with time. How by the 1880s, for instance, this area up here in northern Groningen and northern Friesland, this will become this will increase as a source of immigrants because of particular economic problems that this area undergoes beginning in roughly 1880. Whereas this area down here it will still remain important, but it will become less important as time goes on. Then there's these municipalities along this line here. These are Catholic immigrants coming out of the Netherlands and heading for places like the Green Bay, Wisconsin area. East central Minnesota will be another area and also then in places like Chicago, northern New Jersey, you will find significant numbers of Dutch Catholics, and they all they're leaving from the area along the Rhine River. You'll notice that you have relatively small numbers of immigrants coming from the big cities in this period. The immigrant dilemma for all of them is for this whole 70-year period is going to be, how do we maintain do we maintain our identity or do we assimilate? Quite frankly, this is not an either or situation. A certain amount of assimilation is going to happen no matter what. But some immigrants want to assimilate faster than others. Religion is determinative as to how fast people assimilate. People who affiliate with immigrant churches tend to assimilate much more slowly. People who do not affiliate with the immigrant churches will assimilate much more quickly. This also has economic ramifications. The people who tend to remain within the immigrant communities tend to be held back economically. Those who branch out tend to do better economically sooner. And that, of course, is going to have implications for sending the letters back to the Netherlands to entice people to come beyond who will be inclined maybe to come behind them. The legacy of the 70-year period are ethnic enclaves. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this in a bit. They stretch all the way to the West Coast by 1910. They'll be specifically Dutch enclaves. Political dominance in areas of where they become very concentrated, particularly in West Michigan and in Iowa. And then clinging to the symbols of 19th century Dutchness. What did it mean to be Dutch to these folks? It becomes concentrated in things like windmills and wooden shoes and the gabled roofs and banquet at Christmas time, things of this nature. Here you can begin to see, and this is early on, this is 1870, where these ethnic enclaves are beginning to show up. The concentration around New York City, Albany, along the Erie Canal route, and then here we are in West Michigan and along the shores of Lake Michigan, and then in eastern Iowa and southeast Minnesota. This is 1870. After 1870, these will begin to expand and then head further to the west. In West Michigan, which becomes the biggest concentration of them all, you get place names already by the 1870s, named for just about every province in the Netherlands, plus hometowns like Haarlem or Zutphen, or the Dutch cousins from just over the border in Bentheim, Graafschap. And again, an indicator, and these place names, of course, remain. Or you get a map like this, and this is the 2000 US federal census. And you'll notice right here, this band of green counties, these are counties where in 2000, the biggest single marker that people gave or self-identified themselves as of Dutch background. 2 counties in Iowa, this is Pella. This is Sioux County, Iowa. Here's Western Michigan, so Grand Rapids, Zeeland, Holland, and then up here in Missaukee County. In these counties, the #1 ethnic group that people claimed in 2000 yet was still Dutch. West Michigan's members of the House have been of Dutch background off and on since 1907, non-stop since 1966. And these 3 gentlemen represent a district that's on the eastern coast of Lake Michigan. So the city of Holland, Muskegon, places like that. Then briefly, the immigration to the United States from the Netherlands essentially is going to stop in 1914 as a result of 2 factors. One will be World War I. And another one will be immediately after World War I, a change in the US immigration laws in which the American government begins to limit the number of immigrants that can come in. And since the Netherlands did not have large numbers, when the quota system was instituted in 1921 and 1924, the Netherlands did not get large quotas for new immigrants to come in. Then comes the Second World War and the Depression, which also was going to factor in why there are so few immigrants for 30 years. Then, of course, comes the Second World War. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Netherlands is going to go through some significant upheavals, obviously, dealing with the result of the German occupation, the stuff that had been ruined, the things of that sort, the economic disruption that came with the aftermath of the war, the influx of new people, of people from the East Indies into the Netherlands because of what had happened under the Japanese occupation and then the Indonesian independence movement. And of course, Indonesia becoming independent in 1949, 48. And then the Dutch government's answer to all these problems is to encourage people to leave. That's the push factor. The pull factor is going to become the encouragement of immigration, particularly from the governments of Canada and Australia, but also in the United States. There will be significant influx of Dutch immigrants into the United States in the years after the war, but it will be muted by the numbers of Dutch immigrants that go to Australia and Canada. The ethnic enclaves that I mentioned will be a big magnet for newcomers after the war, as well as the help and resettlement that's going to come from the churches, particularly the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church. Self-help associations that will crop up to help immigrants assimilate and adapt to their new situation. And then sponsors, which are the United States is going to be heavy on requiring. This is going to, can you find somebody who's already in the United States who will be willing to sponsor you to ensure that you're going to have a job when you get here? Those sponsors will tend to be the descendants of the previous of the immigrants of the previous century. What's going to be different this time after the war is that the immigration is going to be much more diffused across the United States. For instance, there will be a significant number of immigrants who will immediately settle in Southern California. One of the reasons for that is because the number of people who are coming in as Dutch immigrants who are actually coming in from, this is the second stop after they have left Indonesia. And you can imagine if you've lived on the island of Java for a generation or two, coming to live in Minnesota or Michigan is kind of a jolt in January, and you will not have that problem in Southern California. Personal ties to the Netherlands being maintained is much easier after the Second World War because of jet airplane travel, things of that sort, and faster assimilation. Because they're coming to live among people who have assimilated already in these Dutch American enclaves. So that to wrap it up, let me give you just to show you what I mean by this. 3 stories of 3 pitchers who played in the major leagues, and the significance of these people, or what you can learn from their stories. The first is Johnny Vandermeer. Johnny Vandermeer was born in Prospect Park, New Jersey in 1914. If I had a map of Dutch immigrant enclaves in the New York metropolitan area, and if I could show you by percentages on that map how concentrated the Dutch were, Johnny Vandermeer was born into a borough in northern New Jersey that was 78% Dutch, and out of a population of about 3,000. His father was an immigrant. Came in 1891, 92, something like that. The reason that the Dutch are in Prospect Park, among other reasons, is who they were buying, who was there to sell them land. And Prospect Park was owned at one time was owned by 2 families. One's name was Hopper, and the other one was Westervelt. They were both descendants of the Netherlanders. When Johnny Vandermeer is 4 years old, his father gets another job, moves to Midland Park in Bergen County. That's land that was owned by a family known as the Wortendykes, another Netherlander family. So that Johnny Vandermeer will spend his growing up years in an environment that is surrounded by Dutch immigrants who are surrounded by the descendants of New Netherlanders. Johnny Vandermeer learns how to play baseball, among other reasons, because the factories where the Dutch immigrants worked sponsored these teams, so that somebody like Johnny Vandermeer could earn himself a couple extra dollars in the summertime if he was good enough playing on one of these factory teams. He was good enough to get to win the eyes of Major League Scouts, and eventually in 1937 he finds himself pitching for the Cincinnati Reds. In 1938, he's the player of the year because Johnny Vandermeer will do something that no major league player has done since or before, and that is to pitch 2 no-hitters in back-to-back games. So for about 5 days, Johnny Vandermeer was the best pitcher in the major leagues. The second no-hitter he pitched was at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, and a large number of the crowd that were there that night was there for 2 reasons. One, it was the first night game ever played at Ebbets Field. Number 2, a large number of people came from Midland Park and Prospect Park to see Johnny Vandermeer play. Second, Jim Cott. Jim Cott was born in Zeeland to a family that had immigrated to West Michigan in 1891. They had settled near Grand Rapids. His grandfather had a milk delivery route, and then for a while he had a store, and then he became kind of a clerk. Jim Cott's father moves into Zeeland and runs a coal business. And Jim Cott will grow up in Zeeland. He goes to Hope College, which was started by Dutch immigrants in the 1850s and 1860s over in Holland. Doesn't stay there very long, and then by 1959 he's playing in the major leagues with the Washington Senators, and then he moves to Minnesota with them in 1961. So we have Jim Cott, whose grandfather was an immigrant, who makes it to the major leagues and has a noteworthy career. There is still a faction of people who think that Jim Cott belongs in the Hall of Fame. One of the reasons why that is true is because of a third Dutch immigrant. And this one comes after the Second World War, and he is Bert Blyleven. And Bert Blyleven was born in the Netherlands in 1951. His family immigrates, notice the dates, 1953. And they immigrated to Southern California. For a couple of years, his father took a job in Saskatchewan and then goes back to California, where Bert grows up and goes to school. And as a high schooler, a number of major league scouts become interested in him, and he comes to the major leagues with the Minnesota Twins, where he is a teammate of Jim Cott for a number of years. And Blyleven will be good enough as a player that in 2011, he is elected to the Major League Baseball, the Baseball Hall of Fame. And he has been trying to get his good friend Jim Cott elected ever since. It'll be interesting to see if this is finally going to be Jim Cott's year. 3 Major League Baseball players representing all 3, in one way or another, representing all 3 waves of immigration from the Netherlands. Johnny Vandermeer, who's growing up in northern New Jersey, because that's where a lot of the immigrants stayed, because that's where they could find people who could speak Dutch, even when they first came off, Dutch immigrants first came off down the gangways in 1846. And Thomas DeWitt and people like him were there to help these Dutch immigrants adjust to their new circumstance. Cott, Jim Cott, who is the grandson of an immigrant who grows up in what was one of the old established, and still is one of the old established Dutch areas that very self-consciously maintains its Dutch identity by more than just its place name. And then finally, Bert Blyleven, who represents what comes after the Second World War, where his roots in the United States are not nearly as connected to the old Dutch neighborhoods as the immigrants who came before the war. So the idea of faster assimilation after the war. And there, Bob Ottenhoff, I think I did 45 minutes, 375 years.
That is fantastic timing, and I love the way you tied those 375 years together with 3 baseball players. That's what a marvelous story. We've been listening for the last 45 minutes to Dr. Schoone-Jungen. He's a professor emeritus at Calvin University, and he's ready now to answer your questions about either your ancestors or about the lecture you've heard today. You can do so by going to the bottom of your screen to the Q&A and writing in your question there. And we've got a few minutes to take your questions right now. Let me get the ball started, Dr. Schoone-Jungen, by going back to something you said during the presentation, and that was that most of the people that came during the second wave in the 19th century were laborers, were blue-collar types.
Heavily,
and
yeah.
The white-collar types from places like the big cities in Amsterdam and so forth weren't coming. Was that what? Tell us more about that. Were they better off financially, economically, or?
Yeah, the Netherlands goes through a series of economic problems that are very deeply rooted in agriculture, and it's a, like I say, it's a series of them. So the first one, for instance, is in the 1830s and 1840s in the southwest of the Netherlands. One of the crops that they grew, one of the cash crops they grew, was a root crop that was used as dye in the textile industries. Well, in about 1840-ish, roughly, some German chemists figured out how to make the dyes without artificially, without using these roots. Well, what that did was there were farmers south of Rotterdam. For those of you who are into Dutch geography, it's the island of Goeree-Overflakkee. Was one of their main cash sources was growing this crop, which was called madder, M-A-D-D-E-R. Well, all of a sudden this crop had no market. All of a sudden these folks had very little income, and it's no coincidence that in the 1840s, the island of Goeree-Overflakkee, and even more specifically, the municipality of Middle Harness, is the hardest core poverty pocket of the Netherlands. And it is no fluke then that when Dutch immigration resumes in the late 1840s, the island of Goeree-Overflakkee is one of the first places immigrants are coming from. And that's just one for instance. By the 1880s, the problem will shift, and the farmers with the biggest problem are going to be in the northern Netherlands, where they're grain farmers. And by the 1870s, they're finding themselves on these relatively small Dutch farms, competing with basically commercial operations in North America, both in Canada and the United States. Grain exports coming from Australia, Russian grain exports that are flooding the market, and these small Dutch grain farmers just cannot compete with that. So in the 1880s, you'll have a significant increase in the number of folks coming from rural Friesland and rural Groningen to the United States, basically fleeing unemployment.
So we're starting to get some questions now. And if you have a question, you can go to the bottom of your screen where there's a Q&A and just type in your question and we'll try to get to it. This first one, did the churches in the Netherlands actively promote immigration to claim land in the New World, or was this driven by the churches in the US. So it's that push-pull thing you've been
Yeah,
talking about.
I would
But there's
say,
a second part to it. Was there competition between the churches, Protestant and Catholic, to expand in the New World?
To answer the second one first, by and large, the Dutch Protestants and the Dutch Catholics stayed separate in the United States. And I got to qualify that. The city that I'm by far the most familiar with is Paterson, New Jersey, and there is a significant enclave of Dutch Catholics in the city of Paterson in certain neighborhoods. And it's not like they would not have had contact with Dutch Protestants because they only lived a couple of blocks apart. But socially, their contact would have been very limited because they were going to separate churches for one thing. So that competition is not going to be that strong. When it comes to the competition between churches, there's going to be a pretty fierce one between the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church. There will be, in the Netherlands, Abraham Kuyper, who is the prime minister from 1901 to 1905, and is a minister in one of the dissenting churches. He will encourage Hollanders who are leaving in let's say after 1880, who are affiliated with his group. He will encourage them to go to the United States and will affiliate with the Christian Reformed Church, not the Reformed Church in America. So that's a form of competition there. As far as there will be ministers, particularly in the early years, who will organize basically immigration societies that will pool the money so that immigrants can finance the passage across the Atlantic. And they will then shepherd these people to specific places like West Michigan, to Ottawa County, Holland, Zeeland, towns like that, or other places, Sheboygan County, Wisconsin, so that the people who are leaving the Netherlands already in the 1840s, they know where they're going. They're not just getting off the boat in New York and kind of wandering around till they find a place. They are being shepherded to very specific locations. Whether they get there is another issue. There's people who are going to fall by the wayside for various reasons in upstate New York, but the bulk of them will actually get to their destinations. And they're being drawn there by ministers, particularly in the early years. And then it becomes a matter of once there are relatives or people from your town in a particular area, that's all the more incentive for other people to follow behind them. The whole idea of chain migration.
So just to push a little bit more on this issue of religion, this is a question from one of our members who was born and raised in the Netherlands, now lives here in the United States.
Okay.
He points out that in the Netherlands, Catholics and Protestants tend to live in their own communities.
Yes.
So when they came to the United States, was religion more important as an issue, or how they organize themselves than their country of origin?
You have to subdivide the country of origin by enclave, and the enclaves tended to have a strong religious component to them. The people from the Netherlands who came without a strong religious affiliation tended to be diffused into the population much quicker. People who either had a religious bent in the Netherlands, or they got one when they came here because of where they lived, because of how the chain migration worked. The religion will, just give you for instances, you would be hard pressed to find a Dutch immigrant community in the upper Midwest on the Great Plains that did not have a Dutch church of some sort. And that could be Roman Catholic in the case of the Green Bay, Wisconsin area, or it could be Protestant in many other places. And you would find the same pattern in cities, so that, for instance, in the city of Chicago, you could find a predominantly Dutch Catholic parish. You could find the same thing in the city of Patterson. There was a Our Lady of Lourdes in the Riverside neighborhood. It was the homilies in the 1880s and the 1890s were being given in Dutch. What you'll also find with the Dutch Catholics, and if you go back into Dutch history, this would make sense, is there is a great commingling almost from the beginning of Dutch Catholics and Belgian Catholics in places like, for instance, Our Lady of Lourdes in Patterson. And there'll be very quickly intermarriage between Belgian and Dutch Catholics. I don't know if that, I hope that helps.
Yeah, so it sounds like religion was both a push and a pull for the immigrants. Yeah.
And let me add one other thing. And it could also tend to be, once they got here, the thing that propelled them away from these communities. You know?
This last question is from someone whose one-way airfare to the U.S. in 1963 was paid for by the Dutch government.
Yep.
One way airfare. So how often did this happen, and how else was the Dutch government helping people leave their country?
They were paying them. One of the problems the Dutch have right after the war is going to be housing. There had been very little building that went on during the Depression, very little, certainly none during the Second World War. So you have the stuff is just, things are just worn out. And then on top of it, you have this significant influx of people coming in from the East Indies. And there's literally, there's no place to put them. And it's no coincidence that immigration from the Netherlands after the war will begin to tail off in the mid-1960s, because among other things, the Dutch economy improves dramatically beginning in the late 1950s. So there's less incentive to leave. And so the government begins to not be pushing people to go. I mean, the other way would be making sure that you had people in Canada and Australia working for, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or in various ways subsidizing immigrant societies that began to crop up, the Dutch Immigrant Society here in the United States, to help people acclimate, find a place to live, things of that sort. I can remember as a kid, specific families coming to the United States in the 1950s, who it'd be interesting to actually interview them now and find out how much of the support that brought them to specifically where I was living, how much of that was government support, how much of that was church support, how much of that was family support. It's undoubtedly a combination.
One last question came in that we want to try to squeeze in. Was Chicago a destination, a way station before going elsewhere, or both?
Yes.
This person, okay, good. Well, this person says, my paternal great-grandfather immigrated to Chicago, but then went on to Wisconsin.
Yeah.
As did several of his friends.
Yeah.
So tell us, what about Chicago, destination or a way station?
It began as a destination in the late 1840s in South Holland and Roseland in the southeast part of the city of Chicago. They started as, in the case of South Holland, it begins because of muck farming. And they become produce farmers, and Roseland as well. They become produce farmers selling produce into the city of Chicago. So that becomes the magnet. As far as becoming a way station, they very quickly by the 1860s, 1870s are encountering the same problem in places like South Holland, Illinois, and Roseland as they had with the number of kids and the availability of land. As the city of Chicago grows, land values go up and it becomes more expensive to buy land. So fathers will begin to think about setting up their sons, and that's going to propel them to move out of Chicago to central Minnesota, to northwest Iowa, to Lancaster County, Nebraska, and into Sheboygan County, Wisconsin, other places in Wisconsin, around Fond du Lac and places like that. They're looking for land to put so they can set up their sons on farms. So then Chicago becomes the way station.
Great. Well, we've gone over our promised 1 hour, and it's because there are so many fascinating issues and so many fascinating questions, and another really great presentation. So
thank you.
Once again, Professor Robert Schoone-Jungen, we want to thank you so much for your just fascinating presentation on Dutch immigration, and all of us at the Netherland-America Foundation, this year celebrating our 100th anniversary. Want to thank you very, very much for your time today. And thank all of you. And if you're interested in learning more about the NAF, you can go to our website, naf.org. But thanks again, Professor Schoone-Jungen, and hope to see you again soon.
Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Okay, so long.